Hello.
Hey,
Hello.
nothing planned for the demo today, unless if you guys have something you want to show. I don't think there's been a whole lot of work due to other activities in the past week, including lots of incidents. But I do have some things for the discussion. The first item are priority one blockers. No major changes here. The big one that's been added is the supporting meta fields and the service definitions for console. I made that MR and it's in review. To move it along quicker, I went ahead and built an EE package, and I think what I'll do is use that as the EE package by default until the change gets merged. Grant, since you just joined, I can specify a URL, a publicly accessible URL to a deb package in Get for the Omnibus Ansible role, right? Instead of, yes, okay, perfect. Then we'll just use that.
There is ways to use debs of Get for sure. I will check right now if a remote URL is acceptable. So
yeah, I mean, if not, we can probably make the change.
We want to support all that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm pretty confident you can, but I want to just double check now. So bear with me a second.
Yeah, this is a case where we have a change made on a branch in Omnibus, and we just want to test it out in Get. So it'd be useful for other people too.
Yeah. So
cool. So
yeah, you can. Yeah, you're fine.
Awesome. So
it should be in the doc somewhere. You can
cool.
put this with Deb, yeah.
So I think I'll do that. The network options for GCP environments. So given that we're no longer depending on the reference architecture module, I'm thinking Grant as and I know I commented to this effect already. I think you responded and you said like this work is planned. I would just like to pass in an existing subnet and use it if it's created outside of Get. Is that something that sounds reasonable or not?
So the update that I've got planned, which shouldn't take too long once we actually just get into the nitty gritty of it, should allow the idea would be to allow you to pass in an existing subnet as well, and that will be done on both the instance and the reference architecture modules.
So I should hold off on that for now. I mean, it's not super urgent, so we can hold off.
No, if you're happy to hold off, it is a top priority for 1.3. So
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Perfect. And then the last one is supporting multiple PG bouncers. This is for Omnibus. I haven't talked to the distribution team about this, and it's not a critical blocker because we have a workaround, which is we're not using Omnibus for PG bouncer, but it would be nice. So I'll sync up with them to see whether it can be scheduled. If not, I think I'll reduce the priority to something lower. Number 2 is the sandbox for the sharding group. I asked the sharding team to drop in kind of last minute. Fabian graciously accepted. So, maybe we can talk a little bit about what the expectations are. What I'm thinking is that we'll use the existing GitLab Sandbox DB environment, and it's not being used by anyone. We can configure 2 shards, and that would be like 2 shards with an IOB, with console for service discovery, and then we can slap an Omnibus server in there as well. What we don't have figured out yet is SSH access. I think all we need to do is add people to the project to give them G-Cloud Compute SSH access, which tunnels through IAP. Alejandro or Ahmad, do you know if that will just work? Like if we have individuals who want to give SSH access, could we just add them to the project as, I guess, as owners?
I think it will work. That's why I SSH into when I was using G-Cloud SSH, and it just works.
Yeah, perfect. So so Fabian, I think all we'll need is like a list of GitLab email addresses who need SSH access, and we can set that up.
Cool.
Should be easy. I don't know what else you want. So does the sharding team know exactly what they want, or we'll have to wait until you play around with it?
We of course know exactly what we want and
okay.
have it all spec'd out. No, so I think actually this is a great start. I'll provide the list of emails for access. My understanding is, and I'm maybe not the most qualified person to say this in detail, that if we had a provisioned Petroni or 2 provisioned Petroni clusters in the way that you outlined, then essentially another single omnibus or a minimal omnibus that we can work with and deploy to and make changes to would be sufficient. I think that is sort of the starting point. If the team feels, we need to do this in a more automated fashion, or we need more help, we would essentially reach out. I think the most difficult part for us was to have the databases sort of deployed in a way that is similar-ish to what would be deployed in staging and then later on in production. So that is what I'm operating under. I know that Camille, for example, has already set up a playground for himself. So I assume that most of the team is pretty confident sort of configuring Omnibus in a way that would be compatible with this setup.
Okay. Super. I will do that then. And what it will be is, a VM you guys will SSH to, and if you need to change the version of Omnibus, you'll have to do your own dpkg, -i or apt-get install or whatever, and you'll hand edit the GitLab RB or the config files if that's sufficient.
Then like let's say for now, I would say yes. If what I would offer is I'll get back to the team and ask is like, hey, this is the deal that we can get started on, but I don't think we need to block on anything. If there's any additional requirements that I'm overlooking, we can always address that in a follow-up. But that would be already great. I was most worried about the database deployments, quite frankly.
Oh, okay. Well, that part we have figured out. So that part's easy for us. It's the Omnibus part that we don't have. So if you're okay with a single Omnibus server, that'll work. This will be the first time that we've hooked up Omnibus to these new Petroni clusters. So there may be issues there, but I'm hoping not. I mean, we've connected to the databases. In the last 2 demos ago, we did a connection through the ILB to Petroni, and it worked great. So I'm hoping there's no issues there.
I think
cool.
in the longer term, one thing that I had thought of, and I spoke with Nick W about this, and there's maybe more for Grant. Like if at some point we were able to take, for example, Get and spin up a 1K reference architecture minus the databases, and then configure that to use it, I think that would be, of course, quite neat because we would have a reference deployment to test against. But I think that it's not super easily doable right now. So
what is that?
Really
I mean, does that give you load? Like what for load testing, or what advantages? Because it can be pretty expensive.
I think this would be then later on maybe for load testing and for benchmarking, because I think once you have Get, you can actually run the GPT framework against all of that, I think. And that would be a thing that we would want to do, like potentially, right, to make sure that there's nothing like obviously wrong when like putting load onto the database now that it's decomposed and sharded.
Okay,
but that's I think is a thing that doesn't need to happen now. I don't think we are at that point.
Get, if it's just released from today, allows you to set custom database URLs. So you can do it today.
Okay.
Maybe not for 1K.
Yeah, but I mean, but
I'll check that. I think so. I think we're fine. I'll check that.
Yeah. Let's start small. Like I think it's like for me that feels like that's a thing that I think we want to do, but I don't think we need to do it now.
That sounds good. I mean, it's not. It's already kind of expensive to set up. Not expensive in time, but expensive in money to set up the Petroni clusters. I mean, it's a lot of VMs, so I prefer to keep it small to start before we blow out the Omnibus side of things and create a lot more VMs.
I understand we should be efficient, but I'm also of the opinion that if there is a clear need for spending money on this, so that we are not facing unforeseen issues in production, I'm all for it. It's
Cool.
definitely cheaper.
Great.
It is doable to set up external database server now for any environment size. As soon as you pass in a URL, Get will assume that you've got a working database cluster somewhere that it can work against. If it's an omnibus like the setup where PG bouncers involved and stuff, that would be a little bit more. As long as the URL doesn't change, that should be fine.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
We can set up DNS for it then.
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, it's designed primarily to work with the cloud services where everything just magically works behind the scenes, of course. But as long as the URL doesn't change, then Get will happily point an environment at a database URL. That as long as GitLab can reach it, I will use it and be happy to crack on.
Sounds good. Yeah, the trick there is ideally we would use VPC peering, or we install the reference architecture in the same project. But yeah, I think that is something we can do later. Cool.
And yeah, it's something to do later. Performance testing is always worthwhile going down that route, whether it's a one-off towards the end of this work, or if you want to do it a little bit earlier, just as a one-off, just to give confidence. I would recommend doing that. It's always worth giving it a go. GPT shouldn't take you too long to do. That's like a day's effort, maybe.
That is my thinking as well. It's, I think the problem that we have in general is, I mean, you will have two database clusters, right, that will need to handle that load, and I don't think there's any expectation that that will be not working, but I think just for sanity checks at the end of this, it may be really be worthwhile. Okay, but is the agreement then for now, you have the Patroni clusters configured, and we get a single omnibus that we can essentially then hand manage, let's say, and that's where we start off.
Yeah, where I'll start off is the omnibus hand managed, but I'll try to make sure everything is connected to one of the database shards as the main database. So maybe I'll create two shards, one called main and one called CI, and I'll hook it up to the main database, do the initial migrations, and a sanity check to make sure that it's working. The web interface won't be publicly accessible, so you'll have to use port forwards or something for that, because we don't use public IPs. I prefer to keep it that way, but if we need to change that, let me know.
I'll relay that. And then lastly, and this is like, I don't know, but right now, are both of these Patroni clusters read and writable, or is one of them configured as a standby for the primary?
They'll be completely independent of each other. And I kind of assume that's what we want, right? Like there'll be, each cluster will have two Postgres servers. One is the leader, one is the follower, and they'll be operating completely independently of each other. That's
the end state, how this is going to be. I was just wondering, the entire thing that Jose is working on with sort of getting to that point will go through a sequence where in the beginning you have a main database that is read and writable, then a standby cluster replicating from that, and then that can get promoted at some point to like migrate over there. And this is why I'm asking. I think I'll check with the team. I think ultimately maybe this is like having them fully independent is maybe even better, because it allows us to sort of assess how the end state would look like. Whereas in, having done all of that work and having these completely connected things, and saying like, okay, this now really works with these two different databases, but then maybe following that, we do want to figure out how to do the actual migration, which is something that Jose has done some work on already. Cool. Does that?
Yeah, I think I think we're good. Jose, do you have any item, like for number 3, do you have any questions about what we're doing?
No, I think you explained it already, that we have this environment for testing or so on. And one question, staging. You think when we will aim for creating this clustering and staging?
So I was thinking we would do this soon, but I think we'll wait to see what happens with the sandbox project. until that's no longer useful, then we'll switch them over to staging. We're not quite ready to deploy the new shards into the current staging environment just because we don't have the plumbing for logging and monitoring done yet. We're still working on that. So I guess we'll see how far this GitLab Sandbox DB project will take the sharding group and then move to staging. I mean, it's not very interesting to have an empty database, so that could be part of it. But
no, so I think that's a great point. But so one concern that I have is that and excuse me for being maybe not super precise with my language, but the way this will need to be set up in staging and then ultimately in production is in the beginning, it will be a main read-writable cluster with a standby cluster that actually replicates from that. And that needs to be essentially in place and set up in such a way that we feel confident that we can handle that situation. And I think then and I think this is something we're trying to figure out, how to get from that state into a state where maybe we can start serving reads for CI from the standby cluster, and I think this is an independent sort of like track from the sandbox, at least deploying this initial sort of standby cluster and having it and monitoring it and all of that. We may not even use it for anything, but at least it's there. And I think one question that I had is like that is definitely something that we will need to have at some point. So it may be something that we want to deploy in staging to gain confidence in it, even if we don't utilize it other than a standby at all. But it would allow us to get confident with our ability to monitor and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think the two tracks are not strictly sequential. They can be parallelized maybe somewhat.
Cool. Anything else before we end the meeting? No? Thanks.
Yeah, my question was more around the timeline of like when you think you would actually have the ability to deploy such a standby cluster in staging with the tooling that you're building.
We can do it fairly soon. Like we could do it this week even, but we just don't feel like we're ready because we don't have the logging and monitoring plumbing working yet. As far as that configuration you described, we need to look into that to see how that will work with Omnibus and our ability to configure through Omnibus. I think we can make it work, but we need to test it out. So that could be one wrinkle in, but as far as deploying what we have now, which are n number of functioning Petroni clusters that operate independently, that works fine.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we even did it like last week. We did a demo where we added a new replica that was successful. Like we've done, so I'm feeling pretty confident in the Petroni configuration. That part's good.
Okay, because that's good to hear, because I like the situation that I'm trying to avoid is, like the sharding team magically fixes all of the problems that we need to fix, and we say like, hey, we are ready to roll this out into staging. And at that point, you are surprised by that, right? Yeah. And if the tooling is ready and we feel confident, then I think we will not be blocked on each other. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
Cool. All right.
Cool.
Well, there's nothing else.
I'll send you the list of the emails after the meeting, and then confirm with the team that what we described here is acceptable, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, everyone.